There are nights when the sky forgets how to be quiet. The stars, usually so patient in their distant burning, seemed to lean closer that evening, as though sensing that something impossible was about to tear through the delicate fabric holding one world apart from another. In a reinforced laboratory buried beneath layers of steel and concrete, Bruce Banner stood alone before a chamber that hummed with a low, aching resonance. He had spent years chasing the same fragile hope, the belief that gamma radiation, the very curse that had shaped him, could be tamed into something merciful. Tonight, he told himself, would be different. Tonight, the storm inside him would finally sleep. He watched the numbers climb along the console, each digit a small prayer. The chamber pulsed with green light, casting shadows that trembled against the walls like living things. Banner's hands were steady, but his heart was not. He had never been able to separate his mind from the shadow that lived beneath it, and he could feel that shadow stirring now, curious, watchful, waiting. He whispered to himself, half a scientist, half a man begging for peace, and pressed the final sequence. What happened next did not belong to physics. The gamma field surged past its expected threshold, colliding with something invisible, something that had no name in any equation Banner had ever written. A rift opened in the air, not a hole, not a doorway, but a wound. Reality itself seemed to gasp. The last thing Banner saw was his own reflection stretching endlessly into a green horizon, and the last thing he heard was the roar of a creature that had always shared his skin. The sky above a distant Earth split open without warning. A comet of emerald fire tore through the atmosphere, screaming across continents before slamming into a stretch of forgotten farmland with the force of a fallen god. The impact carved a crater visible from orbit, its edges glowing with a radiation that no sensor on this world had ever recorded. Birds fled for miles, windows shattered in towns that had never known war. And in the silence that followed, something enormous began to breathe. Cecil Stedman received the alert before the dust had even settled. Screens flickered across the Global Defense Agency's command center, showing an object that did not match any known threat profile. Not Viltrumite, not Flaxen, not anything catalogued in the long, grim archive of Earth's enemies. Cecil lit a cigarette he was not supposed to smoke indoors, exhaled slowly, and gave the order to observe rather than engage. Something in his instincts, honed by decades of impossible mornings, told him that this arrival was not an invasion. It was a question. Mark Grayson arrived first, as he often did, cape snapping behind him as he descended toward the crater. He had expected another Viltrumite raid, another familiar nightmare wearing the face of his father's people. Instead, he found a man kneeling in the ruined earth, thin, disoriented, dressed in torn clothes that steamed faintly with residual heat. The man looked up, and Mark saw something he had not expected to see in the middle of a smoking crater. He saw fear, not the fear of a soldier, the fear of a person who had woken up in the wrong world. Banner tried to speak. He tried to explain, to warn, to apologize. But the words tangled in his throat as the guardians of the globe arrived above him. Weapons raised, voices sharp with suspicion. Someone shouted. Someone else moved too quickly. And in that single fragile heartbeat, Banner felt the shadow inside him wake fully. His skin flushed green. His bones cracked into a new geometry. His voice became thunder. The man vanished, and in his place rose a mountain of living fury. The battle that followed was brief, but it left scars on the land and on the memories of every hero who witnessed it. Hulk did not attack with malice. He attacked with terror, swinging at shadows, roaring at a sky that made no sense to him. The Guardians tried to restrain him without killing him, and each of them learned in seconds that their strength was not enough. He threw them like leaves. He absorbed blows that should have shattered him, and when Mark finally struck him with the full weight of Viltrumite power, Hulk only stared back, unimpressed, growing angrier, growing stronger. Yet somewhere within that green storm, Banner was still watching. He saw a child pinned beneath rubble, and he felt the monster inside him hesitate. Hulk turned, lifted the debris with surprising gentleness, and set the trembling girl aside before vanishing into the tree line in enormous, thundering strides. The heroes stood in stunned silence, unsure whether they had just fought a monster or met one of their own. Far above the atmosphere, in the cold dark where no one thought to look, A Viltrumite scout drifted silently, its ancient sensors trembling with data it could not classify. It recorded the pulse of gamma radiation, the strange dimensional scar, the impossible strength of the green giant. Then it turned toward the stars and began the long journey home, carrying a message that would soon reach the ears of an empire. Somewhere, without knowing it, Bruce Banner had already changed the fate of 2 universes. The forest did not know what to make of him. Trees older than the nearby towns bent aside as the green giant passed, roots snapping beneath feet that should not have existed in this world. When exhaustion finally overtook the rage, the mountain shrank back into a man, and Bruce Banner collapsed against the trunk of a fallen oak, shivering in a stranger's dawn. He did not weep. He had long since forgotten how. But he sat there for a long time, staring at his trembling hands, listening to the unfamiliar birdsong of a planet that wore Earth's face but not its soul. He learned quickly that this world was not his own. The constellations were slightly wrong. The radio broadcasts spoke of heroes he had never heard of a global defense agency that operated in open secrecy, of Viltrumite invasions and a young flying man called Invincible. There were no Avengers here, no stark tower silhouetted against a familiar skyline. Rogers, Nunataja, Notor. Banner had spent his life feeling alone even in crowded rooms, but this was a different kind of loneliness. A loneliness that reached into the marrow of the universe itself. Cecil Stedman watched him from a distance he never admitted. Drones the size of hummingbirds tracked Banner through the woods, and satellites overhead measured every fluctuation of the strange green energy still humming beneath his skin. Cecil had made a career out of solving problems before they became catastrophes, but this problem refused to be solved. Every scientist he consulted returned the same verdict. The radiation defied their instruments. It was not merely unknown. It was untranslatable, as if written in a language reality had never learned to speak. Cecil, ever the pragmatist, gave the order that shaped everything to come. Do not attack. Do not capture. Observe. Learn. Wait. Mark Grayson could not wait. He had felt something in that crater, something he could not name, and it followed him through every quiet moment of his patrol. He remembered the fear in the stranger's eyes before the transformation, the human vulnerability beneath the impossible strength. It reminded him too much of his own reflection on the nights when he had first learned what his father truly was. So Mark went searching, not as invincible, but as a boy who understood what it meant to be afraid of yourself. He found Banner beside a slow river, throwing stones into the current with the tired precision of a man who had done so many times before. Mark landed a respectful distance away and simply sat. He did not speak first. He waited, the way one waits for a wounded animal to decide whether it wishes to be seen. And after a long while, Banner spoke, his voice rough and quiet, describing a world Mark could not quite believe. A world of gamma bombs and green rage, of billionaires in armor and gods with hammers. Mark listened, and something in him softened. He had spent so long feeling like the only person burdened by impossible power. Now he sat beside someone who understood the weight in a way no one else ever had. Their conversations grew longer over the days that followed. Banner spoke of Betty, of the cabin where he had once hoped to disappear, of the years spent running from himself. Mark spoke of his father, of the terrible truth that had shattered his childhood, of the guilt of surviving when others had not. They discovered a strange kinship in their fear. Both men carried a violence they had not asked for. Both had learned that the world often demanded they use it. And both wondered in quiet moments whether they would ever be more than the destruction they were capable of. Far away, in a house that had not been a home for a long time, Nolan Grayson read Cecil's stolen reports in silence. Omni-Man had lived among stars long enough to recognize when something did not belong. The energy signature the sensors described did not match any Viltrumite bloodline, any coalition experiment, any known evolutionary path. It was older than his species and stranger than any weapon Viltrum had ever devised. For the first time in a very long time, Nolan felt uncertain, and uncertainty in a Viltrumite was the beginning of caution. The uneasy peace shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. A rogue alien warband, small but vicious, descended on a coastal city, tearing through defenses before the Guardians could arrive. Banner heard the distant explosions from his hidden ridge and felt the shadow inside him stir. He tried to hold it down. He tried to remember every technique, every meditation, every fragile discipline he had built over years. But then he heard the screams, thin and human, carried on the wind, and something in him broke open with terrible tenderness. He ran toward the sound, and by the time he reached the city, he was no longer running as a man. Hulk tore through the invaders like a storm given purpose. He shielded a bus full of schoolchildren with his own back. He caught a collapsing skyscraper before it crushed the crowd beneath. But his rage, once uncorked, did not remember how to be careful. Buildings that had survived the alien assault crumbled beneath his fists. A bridge that had stood for a century fractured under his weight. When the last invader fled, Hulk stood alone in a ruined skyline, breathing hard, staring at the broken city he had both saved and shattered. The images played across every screen on Earth by nightfall. Half the world called him a savior, the other half called him a disaster. Cecil watched the footage in his darkened office, silent for a long time, before turning to his advisors and saying only that Earth had gained a weapon it could neither aim nor sheath. In the outer dark, a Viltrumite reconnaissance fleet altered course, its ancient captains whispering the name of the green anomaly with a mixture of hunger and fear. And on distant worlds, in taverns and war rooms and starlit temples, aliens began to speak of the Green Titan, wondering if he was prophesy or plague or something the galaxy had never learned to name. The Viltrumite scouts arrived without ceremony, as their kind always did. 3 of them, dressed in the pale uniforms of an empire that had forgotten mercy, descended through the atmosphere over the wreckage of the coastal city with the calm assurance of gardeners inspecting a weed. They did not roar. They did not threaten. They simply began to kill, methodically, coldly, testing the world's defenses as one tests the strength of a wall before deciding whether to knock it down. Mark met them above the ruined harbor. He fought with everything his father had taught him and everything he had chosen never to become. But 3 Viltrumites were not 3 of anything else. They moved with a discipline sharpened over centuries of conquest, striking in patterns that made his instincts feel childish. Blood ran from his temple within moments. His ribs cracked before he had landed a meaningful blow. He heard one of them laugh, softly, almost kindly, as though delighted to find a specimen worth breaking. Then the sky darkened, and the Green Titan arrived. Hulk did not fly. He fell, hurled from a distant ridge by the sheer force of his own leap, crashing into the nearest Viltrumite with a sound that split the clouds. The impact sent both bodies through 3 buildings before they came to rest in a smoking crater. For the first time in centuries, a Viltrumite tasted his own blood in his mouth and did not know quite what to do with the flavor. The battle that followed was unlike anything Earth had witnessed. The Viltrumites were faster. They struck from angles Hulk could not see, hammered him with blows that would have shattered continents. He was thrown through mountains. He was buried beneath rubble. He was beaten with a precision that seemed almost surgical. And yet, with every strike, something inside him grew heavier, denser, more certain. Banner, buried deep within the storm, whispered to the beast in a voice only the beast could hear. "Endure," he said. "Endure and grow." Mark watched in awe from the sidelines, his own wounds forgotten. He had seen strength before. He was strength, but this was something else. Hulk did not defeat the Viltrumites by outmatching them. He defeated them by refusing to fall. Each punch he absorbed seemed to feed a furnace that had no ceiling. His muscles thickened, his skin darkened to a deeper, more terrible green. His roar shifted from a cry of pain to a promise of consequence. The first Viltrumite died when Hulk caught his fist mid-strike and closed his own hand around it. The second fled the moment he understood what he was watching. The third, the eldest of them, hesitated for the length of a heartbeat, and that hesitation cost him everything. Hulk seized him by the throat and drove him into the earth with such force that seismographs across the continent registered the tremor. But he did not kill. Banner would not allow it. The creature that this world had feared as a mindless monster loosened his grip at the last possible moment, letting the broken Viltrumite crawl away into the sky. The fleeing scout carried his report all the way to the outer rim before he collapsed from his injuries. What he described could not be dismissed as exaggeration. He spoke of a green giant whose strength was not fixed but growing, whose flesh drank pain the way roots drink rain, whose rage did not tire but ripened. He spoke of an earth no longer beneath the Empire's notice. He spoke of a variable Viltrum had never accounted for in its long, arrogant equations of conquest. In the days that followed, Mark and Banner sat together on a cliff overlooking the sea, watching the tide erase the last footprints from the sand. Mark spoke of leadership, haltingly, the way a young man speaks of a mantle that has been placed on shoulders still too narrow to carry it. He confessed that he had always fought to prove he was not his father. Now he wondered if that was enough. If being the opposite of a monster was the same thing as being a hero. Banner listened, and when he answered, it was not with advice but with memory. He told Mark of the years he had spent hating the Hulk, of the slow, painful lesson that hatred did not diminish the beast, only understanding did. Only the willingness to stand beside the thing inside you rather than beneath it could turn a curse into a purpose. For the first time since arriving in this broken world, Banner allowed himself to consider that he might belong somewhere. Mark treated him not as a weapon or a threat, but as a man. Cecil, who had watched the battle through 1,000 hidden lenses, had quietly stopped calling him the anomaly and had begun, in private memos, to call him the ally. Even Nolan Grayson, in the shadowed halls of his self-imposed exile, had begun to think of Hulk as something other than a variable. He thought of him as a possibility, and possibility to a Viltrumite raised on certainty was a kind of terror. Hulk himself, in the quiet hours after the battle, sat alone beneath a canopy of unfamiliar stars and did not roar. He breathed. He watched the constellations he did not recognize wheel across the sky, and something almost like peace flickered across the ruined landscape of his mind. Banner, buried within him, felt it too, and for the first time in a life defined by division, the two shared the same silence without struggle. But peace, in stories such as these, is only ever the pause between storms. In the outer dark, on a throne carved from the bones of conquered worlds, Thrag, Grand Regent of the Viltrumite Empire, listened to his messenger with an expression that betrayed nothing. When the report was finished, he did not speak for a long time. He merely rose, walked to the great window overlooking the burning stars, and allowed himself the faintest of smiles. Earth, he decided, was no longer a colony to be claimed. It was a prize to be broken. The days that followed carried a strange calm, the kind that only settles over a world after it has been struck once and knows it will be struck again. Coastal cities began the slow, patient work of rebuilding. Vigils were held for the dead. Children returned cautiously to schools whose windows had been replaced but whose classrooms still smelled faintly of ash. And Bruce Banner, no longer hidden but not yet welcomed, moved through this quiet like a ghost trying to remember how to be a man. Cecil Stedman worked in the deeper silence, the silence of underground vaults and archives whose existence had never been officially acknowledged. He had begun to suspect, from the moment the crater had cooled, that Banner's arrival was not the accident it appeared to be. Rifts of that scale did not simply happen. Dimensional energies of that precision did not gather themselves. Something or someone had opened a door, and Bruce Banner had merely been the traveler who fell through it. Cecil combed through classified files older than his career, cross-referencing anomalies dismissed as errors, myths, and superstitions across decades of GDA history. And slowly, the pattern began to emerge. He found reports from ancient alien civilizations whose ruins had been catalogued but never fully understood. Fragments of stone tablets, recovered from dead worlds, described creatures called world breakers, beings whose power was not merely physical but metaphysical, whose existence threatened the stability of reality itself. The tablets were poems as much as records, warnings passed down by cultures that had witnessed such beings and had not survived the witnessing. One line, translated by a linguist who had died before the war, echoed in Cecil's mind long after he had closed the file. Where the breaker walks, the walls of the world grow thin. He did not share these findings with the Guardians. He shared them with no one at first. He simply read and thought, and smoked in the dark, and wondered whether Earth had been chosen, or whether it had merely been unfortunate. Far away on the black obsidian floors of a throne room that had watched empires rise and fall, Thrag listened to his scientists with the patience of a predator who has already decided how the hunt will end. The reports from the surviving scout had been dissected 1,000 ways. The gamma signature had been analyzed, modeled, simulated, and refused to yield. Viltrumite science, which had unraveled the genetic code of a dozen species and rewritten the biology of its own, could not fit this new force into any equation it recognized. That failure did not enrage Thrag. It fascinated him. He had spent his long life certain that the universe held no more secrets from him. To be shown, at last, that he had been wrong was almost a kind of gift. He dispatched his finest minds along with his most trusted killers. Not an army, not yet, a study. He wanted Banner alive, if possible, and he wanted the beast contained, if not. He instructed his agents to observe, to infiltrate, to learn. Viltrum, he reminded them, had not conquered the stars through recklessness. It had conquered them through the slow, deliberate erosion of every wall its enemies had ever built. Meanwhile, in a farmhouse that had once belonged to a family whose name no one remembered, Nolan Grayson stood before his son and Bruce Banner, and finally began to tell the truth. He spoke of Viltrum as it had been in his youth, before it had become the shining nightmare it was now. He spoke of the philosophers who had once believed strength was a means, not an end, and of the generals who had murdered those philosophers in their sleep. He spoke of his own crimes, not to excuse them, but to lay them at the feet of the men who would need to face what came next. And when Mark asked him why he was telling them this now, Nolan looked at Banner for a long moment before answering. Because, he said quietly, the Empire has never met a force it could not understand. And a force it cannot understand is a force it cannot rule. Banner absorbed the confession in silence. He had spent most of his life believing that his greatest fear was the monster inside him. Now he began to fear something worse. He began to fear the possibility that his mere existence in this world was drawing catastrophe toward it. He thought of the coastal city, half rebuilt, half ruined. He thought of the children in the bus he had shielded and the bridge that had fallen beneath his weight. He thought of every soul on this earth whose life had been altered simply because he had fallen from the sky. And for the first time, the guilt he felt was not the guilt of a man who had done wrong, but the guilt of a man who had been placed, without consent, at the center of a storm. Mark saw the shift in him and did not let him carry it alone. They walked the fields together in the evenings, speaking little, letting the wind do most of the talking. Mark told him about his mother, about her strength that had nothing to do with power, about the way she had held their fractured family together long after there was any reason left to try. Banner listened, and something in him began to unclench, the way a fist forgets, slowly, that it was ever closed. In the outer dark, in a place no telescope had ever found, an ancient device buried in the heart of a dead moon began to hum. It had waited for eons. It had been built by hands that had turned to dust before humanity had learned to write. Its purpose had been forgotten by every civilization that had inherited its shadow. But now, sensing the presence of the world breaker on a world it was designed to watch, the device stirred. A beam of light, invisible to all instruments but its own, lanced across the void and touched the sleeping earth. Somewhere, in a corner of Cecil's screens, a new anomaly bloomed, and somewhere else, farther still, older powers began to open their eyes. Whether Hulk had been summoned or whether he had simply been found, no one yet knew. But the walls of the world were growing thin, and something on the other side had begun to listen. They came without warning, though every prophecy of their arrival had been written in the silence of the preceding week. The Viltrumite fleet dropped from the higher heavens like a judgment, thousands of pale figures descending in perfect formation, their shadows falling across the cities of Earth as if the sun itself had decided to abandon the planet. There were no demands. There was no negotiation. Thrag had not come to rule. He had come to break. The first city fell in 17 minutes, the second in 9. Whole populations vanished beneath the collapse of skylines that had stood for centuries. The guardians of the globe scrambled into the sky to meet them, and they died bravely, one by one, in ways that no camera lived long enough to record. Immortal fell in the streets of a city he had loved for 1,000 years. Bulletproof shattered beneath the fists of a warrior twice his age. Rex Splode's last words were an obscene joke that made the woman beside him laugh even as she wept. Earth's defenders held nothing back, and it was not enough. Mark fought harder than he had ever fought. He carried civilians from collapsing buildings and returned to the battle before their tears had dried. He met Viltrumite after Viltrumite in the ruined skies, breaking bones, breaking his own bones, refusing to fall even when his body begged him to. But Thrag's army was endless. For every warrior Mark defeated, 3 more descended. He watched his friends die around him. He heard his mother's voice on a shattered communicator, calm, brave, telling him she loved him before the signal cut and did not return. Something inside him began to break in a way that could not be mended by rest. Bruce Banner watched the destruction from a hillside outside the burning capital, and he understood with the clarity that only despair provides what he had to do. He had come to this world by accident. He had brought this war with him. Whether the Empire had always been coming or whether his arrival had merely hastened their appetite no longer mattered. The pattern was clear. The Green Titan was the prize. Everything else was noise Thrag was willing to make to claim it. Banner walked down from the hillside as a man, not a monster. He did not summon the Hulk. He did not run. He walked into the ruined streets with his hands raised, and when the first Viltrumite descended before him, he spoke a single sentence. "Take me," he said, "and stop this." The Viltrumite laughed, because Viltrumites always laughed at surrender, but he took him nonetheless, lifting the small human as though he were a folded coat, and carried him up through the smoke to the flagship that hung above the burning world like a metal moon. Thrag received him in a chamber built for such receptions. It was not cruel, not yet. It was clean, precise, and utterly indifferent. Thrag studied Banner the way a scholar studies a rare manuscript, with a curiosity that had no room in it for the manuscript's feelings. He spoke calmly, almost politely, of the experiments to come. He explained that Banner's cooperation would be preferred but was not required. He explained that gamma radiation would be extracted, analyzed, replicated, and grafted onto the Viltrumite bloodline, forging a new generation of soldiers whose strength would grow without limit. He explained all of this as if he were describing a mildly inconvenient renovation of a house he already owned. Then the experiments began. They were not designed to kill Banner. They were designed to unmake him. Needles that could not be named punctured his skin in patterns older than his own species. Machines that hummed with cold Viltrumite mathematics tried to peel the gamma from his cells the way one peels the color from a photograph. Banner endured because he had promised himself that he would. He thought of Betty, though she did not exist in this world. He thought of Mark's calm voice on the riverbank. He thought of the child he had pulled from the rubble in the first hour of his arrival. He held these things in his mind the way a drowning man holds a piece of driftwood, but every soul has a limit, and Thrag's scientists were patient. They dug deeper. They struck the place inside Banner where the beast slept. And the beast, roused by pain in a language it had never been taught, woke as something new. The transformation that erupted in that white chamber was not the Hulk the Guardians had first met. It was not even the Hulk that had shattered the Viltrumite scouts. It was something older, colder, angrier. A Hulk stripped of the small human tendernesses Banner had spent so long weaving into his shadow. The green skin darkened toward a shade that had no name. The eyes lost their color entirely, becoming twin voids ringed in emerald fire. He did not roar. He whispered, and the whisper alone cracked the walls. He tore through the flagship like a rumor tearing through a small town. Viltrumite warriors, the finest of Thrag's personal guard, were unmade with a casualness that bordered on boredom. He did not seek Thrag. He sought escape. Banner, buried somewhere deep beneath the storm, held the last thread of restraint with hands that were no longer his own, and steered the monster toward the void of space rather than back to the world below. He knew, with a certainty he could not explain, that if this Hulk touched Earth in its current state, there would be no Earth left to save. He fell through the black instead, a streak of green flame across the ruined heavens, and vanished into the outer dark before the fleet could pursue. Thrag surveyed the wreckage of his flagship with the same expression he had worn upon Banner's arrival. He was not angry. He was pleased. The experiment had failed to yield replicable gamma, but it had succeeded in something more valuable. It had revealed the shape of the world breaker's true ceiling, and it had removed him from the field at the moment Earth needed him most. Thrag turned his gaze back to the smoking planet beneath him and declared, in a voice broadcast to every surviving screen on the surface, that the war was over. Down below, in the ashes of the last free city, Mark Grayson knelt beside the bodies of his friends and did not weep. He simply listened to the silence and began, very quietly, to think. Hope, when it returns, rarely arrives with fanfare. It arrives instead the way dawn arrives to a sleepless watchman, gradual, uncertain, and impossible to disbelieve. In the ashes of the world Thrag had declared conquered, Mark Grayson gathered what remained. It was not much at first. A handful of surviving guardians. Cecil, older than he had been a week ago, his voice roughened by things he would not name. Debbie Grayson, alive by a miracle Mark had not yet dared to name aloud. And a stubborn, quiet refusal to accept that this was how the story ended. They gathered in the ruins of a facility Cecil had never officially built, beneath a mountain the maps did not acknowledge. Others came, drawn by rumors that traveled faster than the Viltrumite patrols could suppress them. Alan the alien arrived first, his purple skin bruised in a dozen places, his laugh smaller than Mark remembered but still present, still stubbornly alive. Behind him came the survivors of the coalition of planets, worn generals whose worlds had already tasted the Empire's boot, whose eyes carried the specific patience of those who had lost everything and had learned to keep walking anyway. And then came the ones no one had dared to hope for, a small, hesitant delegation of Viltrumites, scarred and quiet, dressed in uniforms whose insignias had been cut away. Rebels, exiles, sons and daughters of an empire whose cruelty had finally outgrown their loyalty. Their leader, a woman named Lucan, spoke briefly to Mark in a voice that carried no apology and no pride, only the weary honesty of a soldier who had chosen the harder road too late. "We cannot undo what we were," she said, "but we can choose what we become." Mark, who had once believed that Viltrumites were incapable of choosing anything other than dominion, extended his hand, and after a long moment she took it. Nolan Grayson arrived last, as he always did, alone. He did not speak of the shame that had kept him away. He did not speak at all for a long time. He simply stood beside his son in the ruined command center, watching the maps of Earth burn quietly with red markers. And when he finally spoke, it was only to say that he was ready to atone. Mark did not embrace him, not yet, but he did not turn away either. And in a war that had undone so much, that alone felt like a small resurrection. Meanwhile, in the outer dark, Bruce Banner drifted. The hulk that had escaped Thrag's flagship had burned itself out somewhere between the moons of a nameless gas giant, collapsing at last into the trembling figure of a man curled against a piece of debris. He had no air, no ship, no way home. He should have died within seconds. But the gamma inside him, altered now by Viltrumite torment, had learned to sustain him in ways no biology should have permitted. He hung in the void, half unconscious, half aware, drifting through cold currents of starlight. It was Alan who found him. A coalition scout, patched together from 3 older ships, tracked the faint pulse of gamma radiation across a stretch of empty space and pulled Banner aboard as gently as one lifts an injured bird. When Banner woke, he was in a small medical bay lit by unfamiliar constellations, and Alan was watching him with an expression that mixed awe and concern in equal measure. "Welcome back, Doctor," the alien said quietly. "There are people who still need you." The healing that followed was slower than any battle. Banner did not simply need his body restored. He needed his mind rebuilt. The hulk that Thrag had awoken still lived within him, coiled and watchful, and Banner could feel it stirring beneath every heartbeat. But this time, he did not try to suppress it. He did not lock it away. He sat with it, in the long quiet of the ship's cabins, and he began, at last, to speak to it as one speaks to a wounded child. He told it of Mark. He told it of Earth. He told it of every kindness he had ever received and every cruelty he had ever survived. He told it that its rage was not a curse but a language, and that language could be used to defend as well as to destroy. The hulk, which had never been spoken to in such a way, listened. It did not become smaller. It did not become quieter, but it became for the first time willing. When Banner returned to Earth weeks later, he did not descend as a green comet. He walked down the ramp of Alan's ship with the calm posture of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. Mark met him at the base of the ramp, and neither of them spoke for a long moment. They did not need to. Everything that had passed between them had already been said, and everything that came next would need doing rather than saying. The coalition took shape in the weeks that followed. Ancient weapons were unsealed from vaults Cecil had inherited without ever daring to open. Gamma resonance chambers were built from schematics Banner drew from memory, adapted to the strange new physics of this universe. Coalition warships gathered in orbit around Earth's moon, their hulls patched and painted with the sigils of 100 grieving worlds. Viltrumite rebels trained beside human soldiers, teaching them how to fight beings whose blood their own had once been. And through it all, a quiet, stubborn hope began to grow, not the loud hope of victory promised, but the steadier hope of a people who had decided that even if they fell, they would fall standing. Nolan trained his son in the hours before dawn, and Mark, who had once resented every lesson his father had ever tried to give him, listened now with the patience of a man who had learned the cost of unlearning too late. Banner and Hulk walked the ruined fields together, in a manner of speaking, and for the first time in either life, neither felt alone in the walking. Above them all, the Viltrumite fleet began to gather in its final formation. Thousands of pale ships assembled in the high dark, awaiting Thrag's command. The last battle was coming, and this time the world would not meet it fractured. The sky above Earth turned into an ocean of fire. Thousands of Viltrumite warships crossed the atmosphere in a formation so vast it eclipsed continents, and the coalition fleet rose to meet them from the far side of the moon, banners of 100 dead worlds burning along their hulls. The two armadas collided in the high dark with a violence that lit the night side of the planet as though a second sun had briefly been born. Alan the alien led the charge from the bow of his flagship, his voice steady on the open channel, calling formations in half a dozen languages, refusing to let a single ship fight alone. In the streets below, human soldiers and Viltrumite rebels stood shoulder to shoulder for the first time in the history of either species, and the ground trembled with the promise of what was still to come. Mark fought at the heart of it, no longer the boy who had once mistaken confidence for readiness. He moved through Thrag's elite guard like a storm that had learned discipline, striking with a precision his father had drilled into him and a mercy his father had never possessed. He fell twice and rose twice, and the second rising was slower than the first. He caught glimpses of the battle around him in shattered fragments. A guardian shielding a group of children with his own back. Lucan cutting down her former commanding officer with tears frozen on her cheeks. A coalition frigate breaking apart in the upper atmosphere, its crew choosing to ram a Viltrumite dreadnought rather than surrender. Every sacrifice etched itself into Mark's memory, and he swore, silently, to remember them all if he lived long enough to remember anything at all. Nolan Grayson found him in the middle of the storm, wounded but standing, and for a moment father and son fought back to back as they had never before allowed themselves to do. Nolan spoke only once during that fight, in a lull between blows, and what he said was not an apology, it was a promise. "If we survive this," he told his son, "I will spend the rest of my life becoming someone you can be proud of." Mark did not answer with words. He simply nodded, because there was no time for anything else, and because he suspected they both knew what was coming. The moment arrived when a Viltrumite dreadnought turned its cannons toward a shelter holding thousands of civilians. Nolan saw it before anyone else did. He looked at Mark, and Mark, in the terrible clarity of that instant, saw the decision cross his father's face before it left his mouth. Nolan smiled, small and sad, and said only, "Tell your mother I finally understood." Then he flew, faster than Mark had ever seen him move, and drove himself through the dreadnought's main reactor. The ship folded in on itself in a silent bloom of blue fire, and Nolan Grayson vanished into that light without a scream. The shelter below was spared. Mark did not fall to his knees. He rose higher into the sky instead, because the war was not yet finished, and grief would have to wait for a world that survived to hold it. Meanwhile, in a corridor of ruined space above the burning planet, Bruce Banner met Thrag alone. The Grand Regent was waiting for him, unhurried, arms folded, as though the outcome had already been decided in his mind. He greeted Banner with something that almost resembled respect. Thrag had prepared for this moment. He had drilled his body against simulations of the Gamma anomaly for weeks. He had studied every recorded second of Hulk's previous battles. He believed, with the calm certainty of a man who had never truly lost, that he understood the shape of what was coming. He did not. Banner did not transform in rage this time. He transformed in choice. He allowed the Hulk to rise the way a captain allows a ship to leave harbor, deliberately, patiently, without fear. And the Hulk that emerged was not the monster Thrag had tortured, nor the wild storm that had crushed the scouts. He was something new. His skin was a green so deep it swallowed light. His eyes carried Banner's grief and the beast's fury in equal measure. He did not roar as he approached the Grand Regent. He spoke, in a voice that carried both men within it, and what he said was simply, "No further." The battle that followed cracked the sky. Thrag struck with all the fury of a philosophy that had ruled the stars for millennia. Hulk endured. Thrag drove him through the moon itself, hollowing a canyon in the pale rock. Hulk climbed out and kept coming. Thrag tore into him with fists that had killed gods, and each blow that landed made the Hulk denser, angrier, more resolute. Banner's voice inside the beast whispered names: the child in the rubble, the bus of school children, Mark on the riverbank, Nolan disappearing into blue fire. Every name became a weight added to the beast's soul, and every weight became strength. They fell together onto the surface of the shattered planet, and the ground beneath them cracked in patterns that reached toward the mantle. Banner, in the deepest chamber of the storm, understood what was coming. If the Hulk continued to grow at this rate, if the fight continued to escalate, the planet itself would not survive the collision. Thrag would fall, but so would every soul the Hulk had come to love. There was another way. There had always been another way. From the moment Banner first fell through the rift, he could feel it still, faintly. The wound in reality that had brought him here, held open now by ancient devices and older powers whose purposes he did not fully understand. He could feel the Gamma inside him resonating with that wound, the way a note resonates with its perfect fifth. He knew, with a knowledge that was not entirely his own, what he had to do. He caught Thrag by the throat one final time. He looked into the Grand Regent's eyes, and for the first time in Thrag's long life, the Viltrumite understood that he was not going to survive this. Banner spoke softly in a voice only the Hulk and Thrag would ever hear. You built an empire on the belief that strength was for taking. I am going to end it with the truth that strength was always for giving. Then he channeled every ounce of Gamma he possessed into the wound in the sky. The rift opened wider than it had ever been. It devoured Thrag in a single, silent breath. It swallowed the last of the Viltrumite command, and then, as Banner had known it would, it began to close on the Hulk himself. He did not resist. He looked once across the burning world and found Mark's silhouette against the smoke, and he smiled. And then he was gone. Earth was saved. The Green Titan was not. The war ended not with a cheer, but with a silence so vast that no one on Earth knew quite what to do with it. In the hours after the rift closed and Thrag's shattered fleet fell in slow, burning arcs across the sky, the survivors simply stood where they were and breathed. Some wept. Some laughed at the strange, brittle laughter of people who had not expected to live to see another sunrise. Most stared upward at the stars, waiting for the next attack, unable at first to accept that no such attack was coming. The rebuilding began, as rebuilding always begins, with the small and stubborn work of clearing rubble. Cities that had been reduced to jagged silhouettes were mapped again, block by block, and the names of the missing were carved into memorials that grew longer with each passing week. Mark Grayson attended every dedication. He read every name aloud that he had known, and many more that he had not. He did not deliver grand speeches. He simply stood in his patched costume and let the world see that its symbol had come to grieve alongside it. In the quiet after each ceremony, mothers approached him with photographs of children he had failed to save, and Mark received each photograph as if it were sacred, because to him it was. Cecil Stedman aged more in that first year of peace than he had in the previous 3 decades. He walked with a cane now, though he refused to admit that it helped. He kept his cigarettes, but smoked fewer of them. He rebuilt the Global Defense Agency from the ground up, and this time, when he built it in daylight. Committees were formed. Oversight was accepted. Cecil, who had spent his life believing that secrecy was the only shield civilization could afford, quietly conceded that a world which trusted its defenders was stronger than a world which merely obeyed them. He never used the word humility, but those who knew him best saw it in the way he listened now, longer than he spoke, in every meeting he attended. Scientists across the planet studied the faint traces of gamma radiation that lingered in the soil around every place Hulk had stood. The energy did not fade the way ordinary radiation faded. It settled gently into the landscape, becoming part of the Earth itself. From this strange inheritance, entirely new fields of study were born. Defensive technologies emerged that could shield entire cities from orbital bombardment. Medical breakthroughs cured diseases that had haunted humanity for centuries. Interdimensional research, once the province of a handful of unhinged theorists, became a serious discipline pursued by universities that had never previously acknowledged its existence. Wherever the Green Titan had walked, the world had grown a little more capable of protecting itself. It was, in its own quiet way, the greatest gift any single soul had ever given a planet. Across the galaxy, the news of Thrag's fall spread faster than any Viltrumite fleet ever could have. Colony worlds long crushed beneath the Empire's boot rose in careful, disbelieving rebellion. Governors who had ruled by fear discovered, one by one, that their soldiers no longer feared their orders more than they feared themselves. The coalition of planets, guided by Alan the alien, worked patiently to offer sanctuary rather than vengeance. Where once the Empire had left only ruin, now new alliances began to grow, hesitant, imperfect, but honestly forged. The Viltrumite rebels who had fought at Earth's side became emissaries between worlds that had once been slaves and slavers. It would take generations, everyone knew, for the wounds to close. But for the first time in memory, the wounds had begun to close. Debbie Grayson kept a garden now. She had never been the sort of woman who kept gardens, but after Nolan's sacrifice, she had found herself with a great deal of silence to fill, and the garden seemed a gentler filler than most. Mark visited often, sometimes as her son, sometimes as Invincible, always as a young man learning that grief was not a problem to be solved, but a companion to be carried. She spoke of Nolan without bitterness. She spoke of him as a man who had failed and then, at the end, had chosen differently. That, she told her son, was more than most men ever managed. Mark held her hand and did not disagree. And in the halls of every school on Earth, children began to learn a new name: the Green Titan, the stranger who had fallen from an impossible sky, the scientist who had carried a monster inside him and had taught the monster how to protect rather than destroy. His story was not told as a tragedy. It was told as a beginning. Teachers spoke of him with the same reverence they had once reserved for the ancient names of Earth's oldest heroes. Comic books were written about him. Songs were composed in a dozen languages. Somewhere in the outer dark, in the taverns of far worlds Bruce Banner would never see, travelers began to speak of the World Breaker as one might speak of a saint. Yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, in laboratories that never fully slept, scientists continued to notice something strange. Faint pulses of gamma energy, no stronger than a heartbeat, appeared and disappeared across the world. They were not dangerous. They were not directed. They were simply there, like an echo that refused to fade. No one could quite explain them. Some, in whispered conferences, wondered whether they were memories the Earth itself was choosing to keep. Others wondered whether they were something more. Whether, somewhere far beyond the reach of any telescope, a green shadow was still walking. Whether one day the shadow might turn its face toward home. The years turned into decades, and the decades became the slow, patient measurement of a galaxy learning how to live in peace. Empires that had been built on fear crumbled into republics. Worlds that had been slaves became teachers. Coalitions that had begun as desperate alliances hardened into gentle traditions. And through all of it, in the mouths of storytellers and the hands of children drawing on windows with fogged fingers, the legend of the Green Titan grew. They did not always get his story right. Sometimes he was a warrior born of a dying star. Sometimes he was a god who had chosen mortality out of curiosity. On one small moon, he was said to be the child of a broken love between the sky and the sea. And the version of him told there was the version his mother would have loved best. What mattered was not the accuracy of the tales, but the shape of them. In every version, on every world, the Green Titan was remembered not for what he had destroyed, but for what he had chosen to protect. He was remembered not for the mountains he had shattered, but for the child he had lifted from the rubble on the first hour of his arrival. His greatness was measured always in the tenderness beneath his rage. Mark Grayson lived to see his hair go silver. He fought fewer battles now and taught more lessons. He trained a new generation of guardians in a school that Debbie had helped design, and he did not shy away from telling them, honestly, about the mistakes he had made. He spoke of Bruce Banner often. He told the young heroes that strength was not the ability to defeat an enemy. Strength was the ability to walk away from an enemy you could destroy, and choose instead to help someone you could save. He said these things not because they were easy to live by, but because they were difficult, and because Bruce had taught him that the difficult things were the only things worth teaching at all. In his oldest years, Mark stood upon a hilltop above the small farm where his mother had once kept her stubborn garden, and he watched the sun set across a world that had almost lost itself and had somehow found its way back. He was not alone. His own children stood beside him now, and their children, and the quiet, humming presence of the peace they had all helped to preserve. He thought of his father, and he forgave him again, as he had forgiven him 1,000 times before. He thought of Bruce, and he did not weep, though his eyes shone. He simply raised his hand toward the sky, in a gesture so small no one but the wind would ever remember it, and he thanked a man he had known only briefly for teaching him how to be a man forever. Far beyond that hilltop, in a region of space so distant that even the Coalition's best explorers had not yet mapped it, a scientific expedition drifted through the ruined orbit of a shattered world. Their sensors had been calibrated for centuries to detect the faintest whispers of anomalous energy, and it was here, at the edge of nothing, that their instruments finally screamed. A pulse of gamma radiation, enormous, familiar, and impossibly gentle, bloomed across their screens. It lasted only a heartbeat. Then it was gone, as though the source had noticed it was being watched and had chosen politely to withdraw. The captain of the expedition, a young woman whose great-grandmother had once carried water in the ruins of a Viltrumite raid, stared at her screens for a long time. She did not report the anomaly at first. She simply stood, in the humming quiet of her ship, and thought of the stories her grandmother had told her as a child. Stories of a green giant who walked between worlds. Stories of a scientist who had carried a monster the way most men carry a lantern, lighting the darkness with the very thing others had feared. She smiled, small and secret, and closed the log without an entry. Some stories, she decided, were not meant to be documented. They were meant to be continued. Somewhere in the endless corridors between universes, in the quiet countries of the multiverse that no map has ever charted, a familiar figure walked. He was tired. He was old, though age had different meanings for him now. He carried with him the memory of 2 Earths and the promise of countless more yet to come. He did not know where his next step would take him. He only knew that somewhere ahead, another world was waiting. Another child was trapped beneath another falling wall, and that when he arrived, he would be ready. The Green Titan walked on.